Hello, welcome to Nonprofit Program Planning and Evaluation. My name is Charles McElveen, and this is Lesson 5, Theory of Change, Quality Review and Narrative. Here are the outcomes for this lesson. Once this lesson is complete, you'll be able to appraise the plausibility of your program's logic pathway. That is, making sure that all the pieces connect together in a logical sequence. The second outcome is you're going to decide if your organization has the necessary resources to implement your program as you have designed it. The third outcome is you'll be able to assess the degree to which your program incorporates well-written and convincing metrics that are able to drive program improvement as well as show fulfillment of your program's theory. And then lastly, you'll be able to craft a narrative that captures the key elements and explanations of the theory in enough detail to make a compelling case for your program. Think of this last outcome here basically as an executive summary of the entire theory. Let's look at some different ways now to test your logic outcomes, your logic pathways. The first is using an if-then method. Here's the way to read this. If I have this resource, then I can conduct this activity at this level. Another way you could think of this is maybe even these resources. So if I have enough instructors, for instance, and enough computers, and enough participants, and enough time, I can conduct this activity at this level. Following that, if I can conduct this activity at this level, then it should facilitate this short-term outcome. Note the if-then connections here. If the short-term outcome is achieved, then it should lead to the intermediate-term outcome. If the intermediate-term outcome is achieved, then it should lead to the long-term outcome. And actually, at a higher level, or even one more step, is if the long-term outcome is achieved, then the program purpose is achieved. Any break in this logic means your pathway is not plausible. So this is an audit that you'll need to conduct on your theory of change, and then in the next lessons we look at the logic model, the same thing. You're going to want to test your logic sequence to make sure everything connects. Let's look at another method. This is called the why is this here method. So in this example, this resource is here so I can conduct this activity at this level. Which leads you to the next point. This activity conducted at this level is here to facilitate the achievement of this short-term outcome. And this short-term outcome is here to facilitate the achievement of this intermediate-term outcome. This intermediate-term outcome is here to facilitate the achievement of the long-term outcome. And again, taking one step further, this long-term outcome is here to facilitate the achievement of the program purpose. This example here is probably going to be the one you will be testing your rationale with more exhaustively. And then here, note also, any break in your logic means your pathway is not plausible. Let's turn to the last method, and that is the what is needed method. So these are, again, 3 different ways you can approach testing your logic pathway. So in the what is needed method, you're going to ask, what long-term outcome is or are needed to accomplish the program's purpose? So we're working backwards now. So you start off with the purpose, and then ask yourself what long-term outcome is needed to accomplish the program's purpose. This could be plural as well. And then, what intermediate-term outcomes are needed to facilitate the achievement of the long-term outcome? Next, what short-term outcome is needed to facilitate the achievement of the intermediate-term outcome. And you can probably guess where this is going next, and that is what activities are needed and at what level to facilitate the short-term outcome. And you guessed it, the very last one, what resources are needed to conduct this activity at this level. So this is simply just a reverse order of what we just saw. What resources do I need to conduct this activity at this level, moving from left to right? What activities are needed to facilitate the short-term outcome? What short-term outcome is needed to facilitate the intermediate, etc., etc. You're going to find usually that you're going to identify the hiccups in your logic pathway by working from reverse order. And that's because our brains are wired to think more cause and effect versus effect and cause. So this is a great check to test your logic pathway. And again, any break in the logic means that your pathway is not plausible, and you're going to have to go back and look at your connections. So you've gotten three methods now. You have an if-then method, you have a why is this here method, and then the what is needed method. Three different ways that you can check. Now, you don't have to use all three. I'm just proposing that there are three different methods from which you can choose. Let's look at our next outcome, which is assessing resources. So in assessing resources, the first thing is to look at your outputs. Now, it might seem odd. If we're assessing resource, why are we checking outputs? Well, the outputs provide evidence that your service was delivered, and you do it in the form of counts. Again, this is a great way to check if you've got adequate resources. For instance, number of budget classes taught, number of participants attended. So let's say that you wanted to teach more classes, or you want to teach more participants. Once you know how many instructors it takes, and to how many students that you have, maybe how many computers that you have, for instance, you'll be able to arrive at a number of how many classes you can teach and what your capacity is for number of participants. Now, once you've got that, then it becomes an if-then. So if I have one instructor that's able to teach 12 participants, and I want to teach 24 participants next time around, well, then I'll need two instructors. Or you have one instructor that teaches two classes of 12. So that's a great example of being able, again, working backwards to assess your level of resources. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is process indicators. Now, that's something that we haven't looked at yet, and we're not necessarily going to use for the purpose of theory of change. It's just something I want you to be aware of, especially as you're drilling down into program evaluation. So what is a process indicator? Well, a process indicator measures the program's activities and outputs. Now, I could jokingly say a process indicator indicates your process, but again, it does. When you put these two things together, it tells you whether your program is being implemented as planned, and that's the kicker, as planned. So you have a plan that you'd like to be able to put in play, and then the process indicator tells you whether you are meeting that plan. This could be something as simple as thinking about gas mileage in your car. You know, you put X amount of gallons in your car and you want to go X amount of distance, and then when you get, let's say, halfway through that gas tank, you check your mileage and find out whether you're on track or not to be able to have enough gas to complete that trip. It's the same type of activity. We do this every day. I want to say not necessarily unknowingly, but it's something we inherently do. Maybe it's unconscious even. Here's a couple examples. So we scheduled 8 budget classes and we completed 6 budget classes. So that tells you that, well, we optimistically planned for 8, but we only completed 6, which then gives us a why question. And this is where your curiosity kicks in. Well, gee, how come we only completed 6 classes? What happened there? Maybe you scheduled 6 and then you completed 6. And so maybe the question is, well, fantastic, we hit our mark. I wonder if we could do more. So Maybe at that point you may want to schedule 7 budget classes and see what happens as a result of that. Here's another example of 72 participants attended, but 60 successfully completed. Now, this goes towards a short-term outcome of an attitude, skill, or knowledge. Why aren't we hitting our benchmark of 72 maybe for this attitude, skill, or knowledge in this budget class? And this will give you an insight into maybe what is happening. And again, the curiosity picks up here of, well, gee, how come only 60 participants completed versus 72? So the process indicator gives you some insight into how your process is actually working. Now, the last type of resource tool you can look at is the input indicator. An input indicator measures the resources necessary to enable the program to be completed. So an input indicator is, I need 1 instructor for 4 budget classes, or maybe I need 2 instructors for 8. But the input indicator is the raw materials that you need to conduct your activity. So that's just another method you can use to assess the resources that you have for your program, which leads us, all this, to establishing convincing metrics to be able to make a case for more staffing, changes in materials, changes in approach, changes in program design. So let's now turn our attention to looking at convincing metrics. The first thing with convincing metrics is to be selective. I'll talk about that here in a second. But oftentimes, when we're looking at metrics, we try to measure too many things. This is great if you're maybe flying an airplane and you've got lots and lots of dials to look at, things to keep track of. But as the scope of that changes, maybe all the way down to just a person flying recreationally, you only need a couple of gauges. Anything more than that is just too much. So that's the first thing, is to be selective and then answer the 5 W's and an H. And us answering the 5 W's and 1 H is the way for you to, I call it sanity check, or to put a realistic check on the number of metrics that you're choosing. So let's go back and let's look at the issue of being selective. The first thing in being selective is measure what matters to your stakeholders. Now, I include you as a stakeholder. And you could simply go out to each group of your stakeholders, anybody from you to a staff member to participants to people up in the C-suite, CEOs, CFOs, donor development, board members, community members, and asking them what to them gives them a sense that the program is achieving its purpose. What metrics would they be looking at? Now, that doesn't mean you slavishly follow every single thing that's suggested, but what I've seen in my past is that oftentimes these numbers overlap. So even though you might be looking at 6 or 7 stakeholder groups, oftentimes you're going to see a very familiar theme begin to arise. So measure what matters to your stakeholders. If nobody mentions it in all those groups, you probably don't need to measure it. The second thing is what tells you the most with the minimum amount of information. This one can be tricky because there's a lot of things you could measure, but what are the things you should measure? So if a graduation rate is important, that's good. If you're wanting to look at a completion rate in a class, that's a separate issue. When you want to start drilling down further into that, it may not matter how many pencils were available to the class or how many paper clips. And that's what I mean is the graduation or the successful completion rate is probably more important for you to track from a program level than how many staples you used. Now, certainly staples you used could be important, especially for CFO, as that person is planning out how much material you need to carry out a course. But again, that's going to come back to measuring what matters to your stakeholders. So really be selective. Think about what what is going to give me the most bang for my buck. The next thing is measure only what you have the capacity to analyze. I can't tell you how many times I've seen nonprofits optimistically select an overwhelming number of things to measure and then realize that they've tracked too many things, because at the end of the day, they're not analyzing all those things. They may only be interested in a few. So when you're thinking about your program design and you have an interest in something you want to measure, make sure you have the ability to analyze that measure. Otherwise, it's just extra work for you, and is oftentimes program leaders and staff are overwhelmed anyways. And so being asked to measure one more thing that nobody cares about is just going to take time away that you would have with your clients. The last thing is be explicit and as objective as you can. And what I mean by that is try and stay away from vague things to measure, or being very careful when you have subjective measurements. When you have subjective measurements, ensure that you have tight criteria that you can observe, and make sure everybody's on the same sheet of music, that everybody's working from the same script and the same definition on what constitutes successful achievement of a subjective outcome, for instance. All right, so being selective, and then answer the 5 W's and 1 H. So who's going to monitor and measure? What is going to be monitored and measured? Where will it be monitored and measurement? And primarily I mean here is, like, for instance, software applications. Where will you monitor and measure those? Like inside of like Client Track or Caseworthy. When will they be monitored and measured? Are we going to do this every day, every week, every quarter? When are we going to take these measurements? And here's the big one here is, why are you going to monitor and measure? And this actually comes back up to this section up in here and being selective. This is, again, a great place to do some quality checking on why you're actually selecting the measurements you are. And then lastly, how will the metrics be monitored and measured? And all right, so that's the meat of it. Let's look on to the last thing. This is more about the assignment now, this next slide. So reorganizing your theory of change. Now, once you've done all the steps of the theory of change, you're going to do a little bit of reorganizing here. And what you're going to do is you're going to put them into this order here. Actually, the narrative is going to be moved up to the top, even though we saved that for near the end. And the organizational fit is going to be more about the mission, vision, values of the organization. Then you'll drop in your problem statement, your documented needs, and your purpose statement, and then these last big chunks here, which is the outcomes, indicators, and assumptions, your interventions and rationales, and then how you're going to conduct quality review. All right, so that's it for this lesson. We'll see you in lesson 6.